yesterday, who's going to lecture in the morning on the topic of pricing time and Marxist and ontology of finance. Most of you probably in some way know his work. He's coming from American University of Beirut. Before that, he did his PhD at Ohrid, UK, where he wrote a dissertation, Alien Theory, which was one of the early texts that helped circulate, as well as his other work, helped circulate the work of François as well, and contemporary philosophy. Probably if you know, most of you know, some of you might not know, he was one of the four people who were initially identified with what used to be called 10 years ago speculative realism, and most of those representatives, including Ray Brassier, are no longer speculative realists, so to speak, and denounced the term, but nevertheless he was part of this term of events in contemporary continental philosophy. He's also the author of Nihil Lamba, Enlightenment and Extinction, and as far as I understand, working on a manuscript on Marx in the moment. And I give the floor to Ray.
Right, so what I'm going to present today, this isn't really a paper, this is work in progress, and what I'm going to present is an exegesis of a text by Suhail Malik called The Ontology of Finance, published in 2014 in the journal Collapse, Philosophical Research and Development, which was an issue devoted to the issue of chance. And Malik's paper is, I think, a very important text. It's important not only because, well, significant not only because of its length, it's about 130 pages long, it makes up almost a third of that entire journal issue, but because of its theoretical ambitions. And what he does in this text is try to elaborate a speculative theory of finance using four disparate theoretical resources. I'll go through those resources, one by one. My goal here is to, in a way, to reconstruct Malik's argument, which is very long and intricate and complex. The aim of the point of reconstructing it is to develop a critique of the conclusions that he draws, because it's a text that has really kind of drastic consequences. It makes a radical claim about the possibility of politics, or how to conceive of political intervention in a condition of what he calls capitalization as subordinated to the logic of financialization. So I think it's important to understand what he's doing, what he's arguing for, in order to, both to appreciate the subtlety of his argument. I mean, it's one of the first, systematic philosophical attempts to take stock of the implications of financialization for politics, but also to query the political consequences that he draws from his account of financialization. Okay? So most of what I'm going to say is straightforward, an exegetical reconstruction of his argument, and then I'll try to point out what I think are the fundamental problems that his argument faces. The first thing is there are two reasons for confronting the financialization. It's the two lessons of the 2008 crash are that derivatives markets present a systemic risk to national world economies, and secondly that the relative size of these markets presents a fundamental risk to geopolitical as well as economic security. So in other words, that the sums, the financial sums now being traded on derivative markets are equal, if not greater than, the sums of national economies. So this is why what is happening, as we all know, what is happening on the markets now has the power to directly affect the global economy. And in order to understand how these markets are able to exert this power, achieve these effects, we have to try to understand how they operate. There are four considerations. Malik identifies four considerations which he wants to explicate, or the four motivating factors for his argument. One, finance power. This is all the passages with numbers are simply kind of quotations from Malik. The others, where there's no number, that's my kind of gloss on his argument. What is finance power distinct from modern state sovereignty? Since finance here is a euphemism for systemic, finance here is a euphemism for a systemic market-led dynamic organization of capital accumulation, these questions cannot be taken up in terms of the motivations, gains and losses of individuals who affect financial power and vicissitudes. What is required is instead what Malik calls a power theory of finance that must take its lead from the operational complexity of financial markets. So what he develops is what he calls a non-standard general theory of price and of the political economy of finance. Okay, so that financialization is now a political power. Okay. The second consequence is the second aspect is futurity. What is most significant about what is happening in derivative markets is the reorganization of the relation to the future via price in general. Not just within the circumscribed arena of derivatives markets, but across the entire social order. And as he will go on to argue, derivatives are shown to systemically operationalize an unprecedented modality of the wager that is intrinsic to the standard notion of betting, but is theoretically and practically unavailable upon the basis of that standard notion. So what is going on in derivatives markets is a kind of wagering on the future, but a kind of wagering which cannot be understood according to the standard or familiar notion of the bet. Thirdly, yes, this is actually the third point because the first quotation was about the two lessons of the crash. What is called left accelerationism, and here Malik is referring to the work of Nick Snarnicek and Alex Williams in their book Inventing the Future. Left accelerationism must abandon its admittedly ambivalent attachment to Marxian and labour-based determinations of capitalism and political economy, because these are not the prerequisites of capital power in general, but tendentious misapprehensions of it. The proposition advanced here is that the roots of post-capitalism and what that condition in its political economy can be need to be instead determined in relation to the most advanced theoretical tools available today. He's quoting Snarnicek and Williams. In practical terms, this means finance in general and derivatives in particular, not Marxism. And finally, a critique of what he calls neo-rationalism. The extirpation of social norms by capital power, a normativity that does not entail the destruction of social order, but the chronic re-institutionalization of a risk order. This is an important phrase. Chronic re-institutionalization of a risk order. This is what financial speculation does, according to Malik. This casts significant doubt upon the political and theoretical adequacy of a neo-rationalist program to the ambitions of left acceleration. That is, if neo-rationalism contends that social and subjective norms can be progressively transformed by the pragmatic universalism of self-revising rational norms, that contention presupposes both the authority of reason not only over conceptual thought, but also over social norms, and also the revisability of social norms. But for reasons that used below in the name of the risk order as capitalization, both of these prerequisites are questionable. Capital power, though certainly not directed by theoretical reason, revises social norms to the point at which social norms lose efficacy altogether. Authority of any kind is not a prevalent power modality in a risk order, and risk itself prescribes any tendential organization or universalist determination, however rationally determined and revisable, other than that of greater capitalization. Okay, so the claim being made here is that, and the critique of what he calls kind of, what is called left accelerationism. It's not a term I think used by, well, whether it's an adequate term to describe what people, Snarchek and Williams are doing is we can discuss later. But the idea that collective self-organization can challenge capital power is precisely what is undermined by this understanding risk order, what he calls the risk order as intrinsic to the logic of financialization. So in other words, financialization entails an operationalization of risk, which is to say a wager upon the future, and this modality of wagering, and this kind of invocation of risk, subverts any voluntaristic attempt to determine the future or to collectively organize in order to construct the future on the basis of an actually existing social state of affairs. This is the radical kind of political contention of the text. That social norms, existing social norms, do not provide an adequate basis for reorganizing our relationship to the future. We have to understand the financial, operationalization of risk in order to be able to effectuate the future. And this means that rationality is not a political resource. This is the basic argument, that risk, or gambling, so to speak, in the specific sense elaborated by Malik, must kind of supplant organization and planning. Okay? So in a way, and I think this is a problematic aspect of the text, it's a kind of it's an even more radical critique of, I guess, the kind of the residues of say Leninist voluntarism in so-called left accelerationism. Okay. So I will hopefully return to this towards the close of the talk. So there's 4 stages to the argument. So Malik draws on 4 theoretical resources. First of all, most importantly, the work of Nielsen and Wickler on capital power. And here he's it's their 2009 book, Capital as Power. Okay, and this is a book which provides, is a cornerstone of Malik's entire argument. It's a challenge to Marxian understandings of capitalism, but also to kind of to dominant neoliberal understandings of political economy. Secondly, the logic of derivatives pricing is a bit of Derridean difference, a remodeling of financialization using resources from the work of Jacques Derrida. Thirdly, the work of Elena Esposito on time binding. Esposito's book is called The Future of Futures. It's an account of financial markets, and the notion of time binding is central to her account, and Malik appropriates it. And finally, the work of Eli Ayaches on contingency and derivatives trading as involving an inscription of contingency. So Malik's argument, in a way, draws on all four of these sources. In a way, he draws critically on Derrida, Esposito, and Ayache, but more or less uncritically on Nitzen and Wittler. And in what follows, I'm not going to, the critical remarks that I will advance in a way won't directly address the work of Nitzen and Wittler, because I'm unfamiliar with it, although I intend to read it. It's been challenged by Marxists, I think, because it's a direct, it's a contentious proposal. But it's also they're both economists, and it's a plausible. Let's say it's a very plausible and ingenious argument. But it's not one that I will focus on in my critical remarks. Although obviously, any systematic critique of Nitzen and Wittler, in a way, would really, I think, seriously undermine all the subsequent stages of Malik's arguments. So capital power. What is capital power? Nitzen and Wittler propose that capital is directly power because it's neither a material entity nor a productive process, but rather the very ability of absentee owners to control, shape, and restructure society more broadly. Okay? This is why, for Nitzen and Wittler, there's no difference between, capitalism is not a mode of production that has certain kind of political consequences, that inaugurates a certain ordering of power. Capitalization is directly an effectuation of power. Okay? The main conflict and power struggle in capitalism is between those accumulating capital, each of whom looks to do better than the other owners of capital. In other words, capitalism there's no class struggle. The antagonism is not between social classes, it's between capitalists themselves. As they put it, or as Malik puts it, capitalists do not just seek to accumulate capital, nor to maximize profits, but to beat the average represented by the normal rate of return. And that rate is set not just by the standard instruments such as interest rates, but also by the rate of accumulation of every company and absentee owner, who are therefore competitors for capital. And the term, Nitzen and Wittler's term for this intra-capitalist rivalry is differential accumulation. The two primary aspects of differential accumulation are price and sabotage. Okay? So first, we must consider price. Price tells us how much a capitalist would be prepared to pay now to receive a flow of money later. Price is merely the unit with which capitalism is ordered, and capitalization is the pattern of that order. Bonds, corporate shares, preferred stocks, mortgages, bank accounts, personal loans, or the registered ownership of an apartment block are simply different incarnations of the same thing. They are all income-generating entities. Okay? This means, this has three kind of consequences. Prices are uniform across space and time, providing universal and trans-historical equivalence, because on this account, prices, in a way, are independent of the value of a currency within a specific economy. Okay, so prices can be transplanted or converted across economies and currencies. Secondly, price is a direct index of differential accumulation and hence of social power. It structures the dynamic reordering of power. In other words, price fixing is power ordering. on this. And thirdly, price is the medium of what Malik calls a transformative power rationality, whose specific historical organization is the result of intra-capitalist conflict. Intra-capitalist conflict is all about price fixing. Sabotage. Okay, this is the second aspect. Sabotage, locally, it entails diminishing a competing firm's capital accumulation relative to one's own, and globally, it entails limiting the average rate of growth of profit in order to secure a differentially greater accumulation per firm against the average rate. Okay? And as a systemic condition, differential sabotage manifests itself in diverse social arrangements, including unemployment, inflation, wage restraints, social fragility, education policy, immigration regulation, etc., etc. Capitalists, this is the moral that Malik draws from this, capitalists do not accumulate capital by seeking to maximize profits by increasing productivity, innovation, and consumption, but rather differential accumulation requires compromising production as such. Business is then not just unproductive, but moreover necessarily counterproductive, as are capitalist societies overall and in general. This means then that finance necessarily promulgates sabotage in general, meaning that it is an inherently counterproductive power. The positive determination of price co-abstract financial magnitude is that it directly indexes capital's power ordering and reordering. Okay? So that through price fixing, entire social institutions and the organization of society can be ordered and reordered. So capital power is exerted through pricing. Okay? Price and sabotage are coeval and mutually determining, directly constituting the organization of power across society at every scale as a necessarily integrated political economy. This demonstration of differential accumulation via price setting strategies makes explicit that the administering price, according to markups, already embodies the power to incapacitate the social order. If price setting advances differential accumulation via both accumulation and the concentration of social power, then prices set the market. Or, once again, administered prices make explicit that price is the medium of capital accumulation qua power order. This is what power is in capitalism. So the power to price is the power to create and destroy social order independently of social constraints. Markets and pricing predicated on finance enable social reshaping and reformatting in innumerable ways that no other ruling class has ever been able to undertake. Again, finance is the condition and means of capital power, and capital is finance, only finance. This means that capitalization is a species of financialization. Okay? As a structural condition of capitalization, finance logically precedes it. Or inversely, economic practice is a restrictive theoretical and practical rendition of capitalization. And capitalism is only a particular order of financialization, meaning that it's not the only possible one. And this is crucial for Malik's argument, because his claim that a post-capitalist society can't be a post-financial society. So what post-capitalism will simply be an alternative order of financialization. That's the basic claim. But now this entails a distinction between financialization as a kind of a structurally priori, as a kind of a structural condition, and financial markets as a kind of social or historic, socially historical instantiation of this logic of financialization. So Malik then distinguishes what he calls the a priori financiality of capital power as a systemic condition for capitalization, and finance markets as practical institutional operating mechanisms and facts of capital accumulation. Okay? So what we have here is a kind of very familiar philosophical distinction between financialization as a kind of transcendental a priori and financial markets as their empirical instantiation, as the empirical instantiation of this logic of financialization. So his argument, his essay depends on articulating and integrating the two dimensions of finance as a priori condition and as historical fact without directly identifying them. And as we'll see, his argument depends upon distinguishing financialization and financial markets, but it's not clear if he can really, how viable this distinction is, if he can really hold them apart in the way in which his argument requires. Okay, now we move to derivatives. Okay, we have to understand what derivatives are, and here, I take Malik's account. It's a straightforward kind of presentation, drawing on standard textbook presentations. So I take it to be uncontentious. I'm not in a position to query the details because I simply don't know enough about derivatives. But I take his account to be kind of reasonably reliable and accurate. So, what is a derivatives contract? The key distinction is between the forward price. The forward price is the price agreed in the contract, and the delivery price, which is the actual price of the asset at maturity, when it will be traded. So, the derivatives contract is made in view of the likely difference between delivery and forward prices, yielding a profit or loss for one of the parties. This means that the contracted derivatives claim is contingent in a double sense. Firstly, it depends upon eventuality independent from and external to the contracted price, which is known as the underlying asset, or the underlying. And secondly, the prevalent sense in which the term is understood in derivatives markets, the eventuality upon which the pair depends may or may not be occasioned, meaning that the contract will lead to a gain or a loss by one party or another, without certainty as to who will be the gaining or losing party. Gains or losses are made dependent. Gains or losses are made dependent on whether the price agreed in the contract, the delivery price, is higher or lower than the market price of the underlying, so-called spot price of maturity. So, the derivative contract, and therefore its market, is dependent on the underlying in one regard only, whether or not the conditions stipulated in the contract are met. This means that the payout of a derivative is determined solely by the terms set up by the contract. And this also means that the historical, material, or qualitative particularity of the underlying is irrelevant beyond the price conditions set in the contract. The standard way of understanding the relationship between price and pricing is as exogenous. Okay? This means that the derivative's exogenous relation to that price is that of a traditionally conceived wager. The throw of the dice is not dependent on the bet made upon it, nor does the speed of the raindrop dripping down a window. By this account, in other words, if one has on this exogenous account of the price and price relation, derivatives are nothing but wagers on a price differential over time. an interpersonal and subjectively constituted reckoning on circumstances external to the wager itself, predicated upon the non-knowledge of the future. Okay? Now, it's this, in a way, kind of exogenous understanding of the wager involved in derivatives trading that Malik is challenging. Okay? So he wants, in other words, what he wants to challenge is the idea that what is being wagered in the derivatives contract is the differentiation between prices over time or across time, and that this reckoning of the differentiation is something that can be, adjudicated. It's an interpersonal and subjectively constituted reckoning on a reckoning on objectively existing factors, i.e., price movements that are independent of the practice of pricing. In other words, this means, on this account, the uncertainty about the difference between the contracted price and the delivery price is epistemic. It's simply you're betting based on your ignorance of the future. Okay, so there's an epistemic uncertainty about the outcome of the wager, and what Malik wants to do is to convert this epistemic uncertainty into an ontological indeterminacy. That's the radical move that's being made. And here is where he brings in Derrida, okay, and the notion of temporization. Pricing as temporization. So, he writes, the contract, the derivatives contract, constitutes a price differential between delivery and strike prices at a specified future moment in time. The strike price is just the price at which the derivative can be exercised. Or, in another formulation, the contract defers the trade of the underlying in order to institute the price differential. And conversely, the price differential specified by the forward contract is simultaneously a deferral of the exchange of the underlying asset. Okay? Or put schematically, the forward contract defers exchange to constitute a price differential for an underlying asset in time or across markets, just as its positing of that differential defers immediate vending of the asset. So this is what Malik calls a deferred differential or a differentiating deferral. Now, the crucial conceptual point here is that the difference between the forward price and the delivery price is not an actually determined magnitude, at least not on Malik's account. And he's going to argue against those who claim that it can be a determined magnitude. And nor is it the difference between two actual differences, i.e. the forward price as the difference between X and delta X, and the delivery price is the difference between Y and delta Y. The future difference, Y delta Y, is constitutive of the present difference, X delta X, just as the present difference, X delta X, is constitutive of the future difference, Y delta Y. The differentiation at issue, therefore, is not the determination of a determinable difference between two actually determined differences, but rather the derivatives contract is the determining inscription of an indetermination. So this is the whole logical, this is why this is, he has to draw on Derrida here. Derivatives constitute price differentials precisely according to this differential logic of temporization, okay? Which is no less their operation. The delivery or exercise price is not the price as and when the delivery price or the strike price, there could be no derivative but only spontaneous vending. And this is why what is interesting or significant about derivatives in Malik's account is that it's not an exchange. Okay, it's not a form of exchange, although it in a way it appears superficially to be kind of a sophisticated form of exchange. Temporization becomes a condition for speculative. So what is going on in derivatives trading is speculative accumulation via temporization. Okay, and this is how you make more and more money. Okay? You make money without exchanging anything, without buying or selling anything. Derivatives on Malik's account are ontological because they inscribe the indetermination of what he considers to be an unpresentable future, rather than the undeterminability of the unpresentable past. And this is where he parts company with Derrida. The unpresentable past in Derrida, it's a trace of the other as the aboriginal source of ethical responsibility. For Malik, inscribing the indetermination of the future is a political act, whereas for Derrida, registering the undeterminability of the past is an ethical responsibility. And this is, I think, significant. This is why he writes, derivatives are not pre-ontological, that interiority being one of Derrida's primary claims for différance. Rather, their ontology consists of a binding and enforceable contract that is constituted by statute. And this idea of binding and enforceable contract, in other words, the derivatives contract binds time, is a temporizing operation. And because it's this temporizing operation that exerts capital power. Okay? This is why the logic of capitalization, capitalization as an ordering and disordering of a social system, is concentrated on the binding of time in the derivatives contract, which is, as he puts it, the institution of derivatives is the constitution of price differentiation. Now, this is why then he argues, and here he follows Ayache, he's arguing against the Black-Scholes-Merton, the standard account of understanding what is going on in pricing, in the pricing of derivatives. In the Black-Scholes-Merton's account is treated as a Wiener process, where the uncertainty of the actual movement of a price in the future is rendered as a probability, a bounded and calculated anticipation. So according to the Black-Scholes-Merton account, the anticipation of a price movement, the measure of changing market forces, is both memoryless and, given its unpredictability, futureless. It is only the present probability of what the future might be, a calculated perhaps, which bears all the information of the system's history. Now, what is being criticised here, and the critique of the Black-Scholes-Merton account, is the attempt to, in a way, to model the movement of pricing in terms of probability theory. And in probability theory, or rather, at least on this kind of philosophical sketching of the theory, there's a segmentation of the moments of time and a compartmentalization, such as past, present, and future are mutually exclusive states in a linear series. So one can calculate the probability of a future outcome based on certain information about the current or the actual, the present state of a system. This means that mean, to be very simple, I think that, well, in Malik's argument, the claim is this: is that in a way, probability only operates if you can decompose wagering into a series of discrete steps. So if one thinks of tossing a coin, when one is tossing a coin, the coin will either land head or tails. The outcome, the determinate outcome, is entirely independent of the flipping of the coin. That's a condition, because in other words, the moments of wagering, understood as the flipping of the coin, is independent of the outcome of the wager. If it's not, you're playing, you're cheating, okay? And it's only if you've got this complete independence of, in a way, the act, the flipping of the coin and the landing of the coin, that you can calculate a probability. And we know that even though I don't know whether or not the coin will land head or tails, but I know that the longer I continue flipping the coin, the more likely it is that there will be a 50-50 distribution. Okay? Over a long enough series of throws, you know that I can bet 50-50 that it will either land head or tails. Okay? But in a finite series of throws, I can never be sure how many times it will land head or tails. The key is that the outcome of the next toss I make can't be determined by the outcome of the previous toss. This is why the system must be memorous. Each flip of the coin must be treated as without relation to the previous flip. So in other words, what you have to do is to kind of segment the order of time, each presence of time into a series, into an action, which is undetermined by the previous state, the previous outcome. And only in this way can you start calculating probabilities in a system. In order, the second aspect is that you also need to be able to, to segment or to discretely identify the possible outcomes. Head or tails, if you're talking about a coin toss, or the configurations, the faces of the die if you're throwing dice. Standard financial practice prescribe a complete account of their own operation as both logically predicated on and operationally constituting the volatility and its pricing that the institution lines. That is, an account of price is more than merely constitutive conditions and forces acting elsewhere. Okay, so the claim, the contrast is between a constitutive and a performative relation of pricing to price. So the claim is this: that in the Black-Scholes-Mertens account, you can represent the possible outcomes of the wager because the outcome of the wager is independent of the practice of wagering. Okay? So in other words, there are these, so you've got an exogenous relationship between pricing and prices, because the practice of pricing is in no way determines the prices. It in no way determines the prices. What determines prices are market movements, are forces operating independently of the exchange, the derivatives contract. And the claim, Malik's claim, and here he's drawing on Elena Esposito's account, which is that what's peculiar about derivatives pricing, or Malik will call the infra-wager, is that here the wagering constitutes that which is wagered upon. Okay? The very act of wagering constitutes the formative relation between pricing and price, as opposed to a merely constitutive relation. And this is why prices can no longer be probabilistically mapped or represented. So the volatility of markets on this account is endogenous as opposed to exogenous to pricing. The future stipulated by the derivatives contract is unpredictable because it is produced by the very present that tries to predict it. In short, derivatives markets constitute prices. Okay? And here, we need to distinguish between, this is actually Esposito's distinction that Malik is drawing upon between present future and future present. Okay? Derivatives mobilize a distinction between the present future, which is our current anticipation of the future, and the future present, or the present that will become actual in the future. What is traded on derivative exchanges is not the future given, the then unknown strike price of the underlying, but the present risk of that price against the delivery price. Derivatives pricing constantly refers to the present way of seeing the future, and not the unknowable future that will come about later. That is, derivative pricing makes explicit in the present the relation to an inactual and necessarily uncertain future present as a present future. So this means that time is system specific. Okay, that the relationship between, or the difference between present future and future present is always, internal to a system. And here it's a social system that Esposito is talking about. The maintenance within the present of past and future presents depends entirely on the structure, organization, and capacities of any given system. This is why derivative pricing and its volatility are, in short, constructions of time. Now finally, Malik then needs to distinguish between what he calls the extra wager and the infra wager. Okay? The extra wager is a standard notion of wagering. An extra wager, the gambler is constituted by her or his necessarily limited knowledge of an inactual future occurrence. This is a subjective manifestation of the inadequacy of finite epistemology to ontology. In other words, we gamble about what we don't know. Okay? No one ever gambles on something that they know. The attempt to kind of to mitigate the risk incurred by gambling by probability, in other words, by trying to kind of to predict the likelihood of an outcome, is a way of lessening or diminishing the risk of incurred by gambling. And that means this is prediction. This is all the prediction. If you can find a way of predicting the likelihood of an outcome, you diminish the risk. And Malik's claim is that in derivatives trading, which is the infra wager, there's no attempt to, the absolute uncertainty is itself what is wagered upon. Okay? What is being wagered is the absolute indeterminability of the future state. This is why it's this is why risk is ontological in Malik's account. And this is why in the infra wager, any instance of derivative pricing is a wager placed not just in an indefinite betting process, but also on it. Derivatives markets pricing is thereby akin to odds lengthening or shortening on a bet according to what other bets are placed. What is priced by derivatives markets then is the pricing process itself. Unlike the extra wager, derivatives pricing is an infra wager for which the terms at expiration are not externally determined conditionalities, but only parametric constraints. So this means what is being wagered in derivatives is wagering itself. You're betting on a bet. You're not betting on some kind of outcome that is external to the action of betting. And this is why there's a peculiar involution going on in derivatives pricing. It's the pricing of the pricing process itself, and nothing that is independent of that process actually enters into it. And basically, in a way, the orthodox, let's say the Black-Scholes-Merton theorem, according to Malik and Ayashi, is an attempt in a way to represent pricing, as if pricing was a kind of an activity that was connected to, or somehow that was interacting with processes in the world that are in some kind of objectively distinct reality independently of this activity. Whereas what both Malik and Ayashi emphasize is that the reason why, in a way, the pricing is the inscription of a kind of absolute contingency, or the inscription of an indeterminability as such, is because it's a practice which doesn't reflect or represent any independent reality or any data or information from outside the practice of pricing. So this is why I'll read this, the concluding remark about thetic contingency. In addition to the contingency of abstraction that is a universal fungibility of the underlying of the forward contract, the derivative is also contingent in that it posits a speculative, as yet unknown eventuality. That eventuality does not pre-exist the contract, but is fabricated by it. Because this is what we've already seen, that you're actually producing the outcome that you are betting upon. The contract constitutes its in actuality an unknownness. In other words, the unknown that is being wagered in the contract is not independent of the institution of the contract. The two outcomes are the branches of two different realities, only one of which will be actualized at expiration because of the contract. It follows that the derivative contract is, in Ayashi's terms, always a contingent claim. But the contingency identified by Ayashi is one that the derivative constitutes and inaugurates, and as such can be designated as its thetic contingency. In other words, it's a thetic contingency precisely because it is instituted by the wager or by the institution of the contract. What this third contingency of derivative constitutes is its deracination, not with regard to the underlying, from which the derivative is deracinated by the contingency of abstraction, but rather the deracination of price itself in the pricing process. It posits that the world is actually what it is in reality. The derivative has a particular price in fact, except that it could have been different. Only one of the contingent inactualities is actualized, the other remains inactual. So I take the claim to be here is that, and it's explicit in Ayachi's work, there's a distinction in a way between, there's an appeal to a kind of a Bergsonian distinction between virtuality and possibility. In other words, possibility is always abstracted from actuality. In Bergson's account, possibility is always retrojected as a state of affairs that could have been actualized, in fact, but was not. But this involves thinking of time in particular as decomposable into discrete instants, and in a way as the movement of time as being the movement of actualization, the actualization of a possibility, a possible state of affairs that is somehow adjoined to the actual state of affairs. In other words, what could be is determinable on the basis of what is. And the Bergsonian claim is that is that, in a way, futurity or virtuality is precisely never what could be if what could be is understood as a possibility inscribed in actuality. So in Ayachi's account of CT contingency, the contingent inactuality, the actualized inactuality is not the realization of a possibility, okay? Because what is inactual or virtual this is why, in a way, this is an infrawager. You're not simply wagering on the basis of your ignorance of what could be, your ignorance of what could be. You're wagering on something that is not just unknown, but unknowable because it's indeterminable. It's indeterminable. And hence this is, the distinction then between that which is possibility. If the future is understood as a reservoir of possibility, it is determinable. In other words, you can predict what could be on the basis of what you know about what is. But on this account, what might be or what may be is unforeseeable and unpredictable because nothing that we know about what is provides a reliable index to what may be. And here, why? Because the representation of the world is this kind of discrete segmentation into substances and attributes and combinations of objects in states of affairs. Okay? So it's this whole ontology of representation that is being challenged by Ayachi's account of CT contingency and taken up by Malik in his account of the infrawager. Now, so this is why there's. So, what is the kind of the radical consequence? It's that we have to. The infrawager, as exemplified by derivatives trading, is a practice of time binding. Okay, it's a practice of time binding, which has the power to to generate order, to order and disorder a system without any provision, okay? Without any provision. And this is why it's a challenge to any kind of model of political agency which is predictive, or which supposes that it's possible to to construct the future on the basis of the present. In a way, so the future is non-constructible on this account. It can only be wagered, but the wager is what will constitute the future. And financialization is a practice that allows you to kind of to constitute the future in a way without mediation, without having to rely on anything you know about the present. And that's why this is its radical political valence. Now, just a couple of, I think some critical observations here. First of all, so as I said, if we go back to, right back to the beginning. The four stages of the argument: Nitz and Bittler, differentiation, time-binding, thetic contingency. Okay. So I'm not going to say anything about Nitz and Bittler, though obviously, a systematic critique of their arguments would effectively kind of, disable all the consequences that Malik wants to draw. But first of all, so I'll just focus on B, C, and D. First of all, I think there's a problem about the attempted link between, differential temporization and, systemic time binding on this account. Now, if you remember, Derrida's argument, Derrida's argument for it's a critique of a certain kind of phenomenological orientation. It's a critique of the Husserlian notion of the living present. So, I take Derrida's claim to be that in Husserlian phenomenology, what is not yet and what has been are somehow kind of intrinsic to what is, to the experience of the present. Because what is cannot be understood in terms of a substantial actuality. Okay, so it's the idea that the living presence of consciousness, or phenomenological experience, is never a punctual moment, because it is constituted by the anticipation of what is not yet and the retention of what has been. And this anticipation and retention, in a way, are relations, intentional kind of acts in Husserl's account, which make a kind of absence constitutive of the present. But Derrida wants to radicalize this relationship between presence and absence by arguing that what is present can only be present in a way, according to a certain mode of absence. Okay, so he wants to deconstruct the opposition between presence and absence, and in a way claim that both the anticipation of the future and the retention of the past presuppose the relationship to something, to the unpresentable. Now, the standard criticism of this movement would be to say that all of this, that Derrida's critical claim is actually already there, it's already in Husserl's account, or in Heidegger's account. So the standard rejoinder is to say that this kind of subversion of the metaphysics of presence is already understood by phenomenology. But the claim, I think, is that there's a problem about transplanting this logic of temporization to a social system. Okay? Because here it seems that the relationship between the present future and the future present can't be straightforwardly adjudicated by appealing to something like self-consciousness. In other words, if we go back to the distinction, the account of Esposito, yes. So the distinction between the present future, which is our current anticipation of the future, and the future present, or the present that will become actually the future, notes that there's, note the reference to current anticipation, and differences between what we currently anticipate will be, and what will be independently of our current anticipation. Okay? Now, but there seems to be a problem about marking this distinction between present future and future present in a social system. And the reason is that the current anticipation of the future is also conditioned by a set of representations or by representations which unfold in time. In other words, what I want to say is this, is that there's a distinction between represented time, or the time that is represented, the time experienced by a system, and the time of representing, the time in which the system represents its own relationship to the world and experiences the difference between present future and future present. Okay? In other words, that this is already a kind of a straightforward kind of philosophical distinction between the representation of succession is not equivalent to the succession of representation. The representation of succession is conditioned by a succession of representation which may not be actually represented. Okay, so surely, if we're talking about something as complicated as a social system, then the difference between present future and future present is itself conditioned by a difference between the present of representation, which the system in a way kind of constitutes its own self-representation, and the future that will be that will condition its present self-representation. In other words, I'm saying that you have to the whole account of kind of a system as any system capable of differentiating between present future and future present is embedded in a time order which conditions the time order experienced by the system. So in other words, there's a time that is internal to the system and a time that is external to the system that conditions the generation of time within the system. And this means that there's something peculiar about using the distinction between present future and future present, and even the cross-contamination of present future and future present to yield this inscription of the indeterminability of the first observation. Yes, this then means that this then, I think, calls into question the distinction between financialization, or the distinction that's necessary to Malik's argument, between financialization as a kind of structural a priori and financial markets as their, as historically conditioned social practices. In other words, it's one thing to say that the practice of pricing doesn't mirror or reflect price movements in a reality which is somehow independent of the market. But in a way, the performativity of pricing and the fact that you can no longer kind of segment the institution of a contract or the institution of a price. Surely it means that what is the determining factor. There is a determining factor operative in pricing, but why not call it? Why isn't it straightforwardly empirical? In other words, why isn't it the trader's contingent psychological states? In other words, why you need the Derridean register in a way to kind of to enforce this distinction between the unpresentable a priori and the merely the contingent historical incarnation of this wagering on the unpresentable. But that's only if you're sure that the time binding, that this account of wagering actually affects time binding. And if the binding of time in the derivatives contract is conditioned by factors which are unavailable to the participants or the practitioners of pricing, then in what way can this in what way can wagering be taken to be constitutive of time binding at a systemic level? Okay? It seems that once one recognizes this difference between the different orders of presented time or represented time and the time of represented, then everything that's going on at the level of wagering can be conditioned by factors which may be unavailable to the participants in the wager, but which are perfectly kind of recognizable or identifiable to someone, to a sufficiently kind of fine-grained empirical analysis. So in other words, so I think the transcendentalization of the infra-wager is dubious. What we're doing is we're taking, so we've got pricing as a kind of as a peculiar practice, the pricing of pricing as something that seems to be kind of entirely impervious to any kind of external social determination. And this then becomes, the kind of the transcendently, constitutive moment, it affects the operational binding for the entire system, independently of the the empirical conditions of the market traders. But once one questions this, the transplantation of the Derdine account, it seems that what is, the performativity of pricing is purely empirical and not transcendental. Okay? In other words, it's just like if you're, or the endogeneity of the volatility of pricing, the fact that pricing depends upon what the traders happen to believe or what they have for breakfast doesn't kind of designate, or there's no rationale for transcendentalizing that volatility. In other words, the risk inscribed in wagering is empirical and not transcendental. And therefore it seems dubious to ontologize it. Yes, finally, one final observation about a more general observation about this ontologization of risk is that what's decisive in this argument is the claim that temporal indeterminacy, or the indetermination of the future, is ontological and not merely epistemic. So therefore, that no rational action or no projection can realize the future. In other words, we can't plan or predict or organize. But clearly there are, two things. One is that this seems a kind of, a contentious generalization of an experiential account, an account of, it's explicit in Ayachi's references to figures like Bergson. The whole critique of representation has claimed that nothing about the dynamic movements through which the future realizes itself are unrepresentable and unforeseeable on the basis of any information we have. Any of those characteristics of aspects of the world that we can represent is it's based on the primacy of lived experience, a kind of the primacy of subjectivity, of an absolute subjectivity over any relationship to objectivity. Okay? So it's kind of undialectical in that sense. And this is why the peculiar consequence, if one reads Ayachi, is that trading becomes this kind of radical creative act. Okay, trading becomes an inscription of an absolute indetermination or absolute contingency, and it becomes a creative act. And Malik, he doesn't talk about creativity, but he talks about time binding. It also kind of is as if the synthesis of time depends upon this inscription of this radical indeterminability. But this is a peculiarly subjectivistic, this whole kind of account, which is supposedly radically anti-humanist, has in a way curiously subjectivistic premises. If one has a more dialectical kind of understanding of the relationship between subjective and objective, and if one refuses to absolutize immediacy, whether phenomenologically or vitalistically in a Bergsonian register, then it's not true to say that the future is not just is radically indeterminable. We can successfully predict outcomes. We can successfully predict outcomes by, in a way, because the difference, because it's the border between stability and instability can always be temporarily circumscribed by a sufficiently sophisticated understanding of dynamic processes. And I think that here the reason why, in a way, for Black Scholes Merton, they attempt to kind of to model, to construct a probabilistic modeling of pricing is perhaps is unsatisfactory. Is not because there's something. It's not because pricing inscribes some kind of radical indeterminability of the future, but simply because everything that traders are doing is a kind of a complex, an extremely complex nesting of entirely kind of arbitrary inclinations. Okay, because what they are, how they will wager is determined by the outcome of their previous wager and their anticipated outcome of their next wager. And surely this is simply kind of a series of it's a determination of one moment by the next, which is entirely empirical and not, or which can be characterized as entirely empirical and doesn't need to be, extrapolated into this kind of speculative register. In other words, the trader's own ignorant gambling in the way in which they're gambling, the fact that they rely on hunches and guesses, and the fact that these hunches or guesses can only be sociologically described and not probabilistically represented, is like just trivial. It seems to be just a trivial kind of epistemic fact, and not something that should be inflated into an ontologization of risk. And finally, notoriously, the risks. It's never the traders themselves that are incurring these risks. It's always the consequences, the empirical consequences, the gains or losses in social terms will always be incurred by people outside of the market, and this is why, although Malik's account is, it's a kind of it's an attempt to reappropriate in a way the ontologization of risk for an emancipatory politics as opposed to a kind of reactionary kind of Darwinian liberalism, in which, because the claim that the future is radically unforeseeable, that we can't plan or project or organize, is a familiar claim of neoliberal ideologues. There's nothing radical about that claim. And so therefore this whole argument, it seems to me, relies on a kind of a rejection of voluntarism and of rationalism as wholly inadequate to the task of, effecting an emancipatory transformation or a reordering of society on the basis of, the well-known catastrophic consequences of, revolutionary politics in the 20th century. But it seems insufficient. There's no principled argument as to why we can't successfully reorganize reorganize society on the basis of in a way trying to kind of construct future institutions on the basis of revising current institutions. Now, the problem is that this, here, the focus is on, Malik is rejecting this, what he calls this rationalistic account, that because if transcendental constitution is social institution, means that the way in which we understand ourselves and the way in which we collectively organize and the way in which we reason about means and ends is a reflection of certain, a series of social institutions which are themselves kind of historically determined. But an understanding of I guess what is required, the corrective that Malik wants to, by immediately invoking the Nixon and Hitler account. Okay, I mean, that's not very well thought, it's not very well put, but what I'm trying to say is that we need, what drops out of this account is financialization turns out to be the kind of determinant in the last instance for socialization. But what I'm saying is that financialization itself presupposes a social practice, okay, which that social practice has this extraordinary capacity to reorder, to create and destroy social order, is a consequence of, familiar social relations, which have to do with property. And if we understand that, then it seems that we can. I don't see the kind of the need to advert to the financialization in order to achieve this reordering of society. It seems that the only, again, the key presumption is that reordering predicated on a programmatic reordering will simply be totalitarian. Okay? That's the basic, I think, the unstated premise here. And although we know that programmatic reorderings have yielded, totalitarian consequences, but unless you make, it seems bizarre to make totalitarianism the ineluctable consequence of voluntarism. That's a kind of peculiar, and that's a standard neoliberal trope, is that anything, if you will to change the world in a certain way, you're going to start, you'll start, shipping people off to gulags, which is like, that's just ideology, it seems to me. These are my concluding kind of remarks, not very well crisply formulated, but perhaps we should, I'll stop and then we can continue the discussion.
We're going to have a break now.
Okay.
We'll have a break now, and in 2 minutes we'll regather for Q&A.
Okay.